our ideas about how different nationalities process war it's complex. And I think it applies just as much to Britain.
Hello. On the outskirts of North London, near Chipping Barnet and Enfield, stands a marvellous country house, Trent Park, that belonged to the Sassoon family. In 1939 it was requisitioned by the British government, whereupon it became a luxurious POW camp for German prisoners. Why treat them so kindly? Well, senior Wehrmacht and Nazi officers were lulled into a false sense of security, they let their guard down and discussed war plans and their murderous outlook openly, all of which were recorded and translated by listeners in the cellars of the house. Many of these listeners were Jewish refugees. Today's guest is Jane Thynne, whose new book Appointment in Paris features Trent Park, so we discuss that and plenty more, including France during the war. If you can share with friends and family, I'd be most grateful, but until then it's me talking Appointment in Paris with Jane Thynne. Jane, welcome back to the podcast. A great pleasure to have you on again.
Oh, it's so enjoyable. Thank you, Ollie. I look forward to talking about my new novel.
Well, yes. So, Appointment in Paris, which is the sequel to Midnight in Vienna, which we discussed, I think, last but one time you were on. And Appointment in Paris this time. I guess why don't I just ask briefly what the plot is for the new one, because I haven't got it in front of me just yet.
So Appointment in Paris is indeed the second in the Fox and Fry series. And the germ of the idea came to me a long time ago, at least 5 or 6 years ago, when I visited a place called Trent Park, which is a stately home just north of London in Cockfosters. And it's fascinating place because in 1939, before 1939, it was owned by a very flamboyant, stylish MP called Philip Sassoon. And he had the entire place done out incredibly beautifully with murals by Rex Whistler and literally the last word in interior decor. And he would have socialites, Hollywood stars, Charlie Chaplin, the Duke of Windsor, all sorts of extremely glamorous guests would come and weekend at Trent Park. And then in 1939, Philip Sassoon died, and he had asked that the house would be used for the nation. And so the government took him up on it, and they requisitioned Trent Park and turned it into a holding place for captured German and Italian prisoners, people who'd either been downed from aeroplanes or had been caught in U-boats. And so this was where they were going to put them. Previously, in the very earliest bit of the war, they'd been keeping people in the Tower of London, but there wasn't enough room. So a fascinating man called Thomas Kendrick, who may have popped up on this podcast before, but he was a very important man in British intelligence during World War II. And Thomas Kendrick took on the task of transforming Kent Park. Now, previously, Thomas Kendrick had been at the British Embassy in Vienna, and he was fluent in German himself. But what he did with Trent Park was something really special. He kept it exactly as it was. So it was incredibly luxurious and opulent, but every single bit of furniture, every room, every picture, every lampshade was wired. They brought in these engineers from Dollis Hill who put in the last state-of-the-art, last word microphones, recording equipment. And so every bit of the house, and even the grounds, the trees, were wired for sound. And then the special bit of it all was the basement, because in the basement there were recording devices. So everything that was recorded in all the rooms and the cells was diverted down into the basement. And largely German Jewish refugees were brought in secretly into the basement to listen to whatever these officers were talking about, transcribe it, and sift it for intelligence, or send it off to be sifted for intelligence. None of the officers talking in the beautiful surroundings above knew that their every word was being recorded. So it was a fascinating setup. And one of the things about it also was the fact that you might say, look, you've got high-level German generals. They must expect, they must suspect something. They're having their food brought in sometimes from the Ritz. They've got access to a tailor, any book they choose, all sorts of luxuries unknown to the general population. Weren't they suspicious? And the answer was they were. But the reason they decided that the British were treating him in this extraordinary manner was because the Brits were surely convinced they were losing the war. And they were going to lose the war, and so it would stand them in very good stead if they treated their captives kindly. Even then, actually, the prisoners of war were cautious because everybody in Nazi Germany was recording everybody else covertly. So it was a well-known technique. So they were very careful sometimes where they spoke, and sometimes they would lean out of the window. If they had something to say, they'd lean out the window, have a cigarette. But Kendrick had made sure to wire the windowsills so that even what they said off guard would be picked up. And this was all tremendously important. And a lot of the intelligence that it threw up was crucial to the course of the war. I mean, very specifically, generals at Trent Park revealed the location of Peenemünde, the base, the Nazi base where the V2 and V1 rockets were being built. So that was incredibly useful. So these bits of information were recorded. So Trent Park itself, absolutely fascinating. But for years, the bit that fascinated me was decades, nobody really knew about it. Everybody knew about Bletchley Park, which was another secret establishment not that far away. Everybody knew about Bletchley Park. Nobody knew about Trent Park. And I also had no idea. And what happened was that there was a German historian called Sonke Nietzsche, who in 1985 was doing some work in the archives at Kew about German prisoners of war, and he came across a total, huge numbers of manila files full of these transcripts of recorded information, and he read them with kind of growing fascination. And what he realized, and he turned it into a book, was something tremendously important to post-war German psychology, which was there had been a feeling that although huge atrocities and depravities were carried out in World War II, the generals and the very refined people at the top wouldn't have had anything they wouldn't have been the same. And what these recordings reveal is that even the most refined of generals had been participants in mass rapes, in kind of casual slaughter. In other words, nobody was above the fray.
Yeah, that whole lie about the Wehrmacht being, the sort of gentlemen, it was that all the, the SS behaved badly, and we in the Wehrmacht, we're gentlemen officers. It's just rubbish.
Exactly that myth. And he wrote a book called Soldaten, which exploded that myth and it was published in Germany, had a huge effect on the German the German historical population, people that read history books. It had an effect. And it wasn't translated back into English for some years. And then I read it and I thought, wow, that's very interesting. So this is kind of the background of Trent Park. So I was really interested in the place. But when I came to write the Fox and Fry novels, which have this character, Harry Fox, a former MI5 watcher who's been suspended, and Stella Fry, who actually has got into the whole thing by mistake. She was living in the continent and she had to come back because of the Anschluss, and she's just fallen into this investigation role with Harry Fox, the chalk and cheese. But anyhow, at the beginning of Appointment in Paris, she comes back. She's got a flat in Battersea. She's working for the Crown Film Unit. She comes back home, and there's a huge crowd outside her block, and she kind of, as you do when you see a crowd of onlookers, you join in. What on earth's happening? And they say, well, there's something awful has happened, and everybody's jostling for a look. And somebody says, it's about a young woman. Something awful's happened to her. I think she's done herself in, or she's thrown herself under a train or something. And some policemen came up, and they shoo everybody away. And Stella says, who is it? Who is this? And somebody says, oh, it's a young woman called Stella Fry. And of course, she realizes at that moment that quite obviously it's not anything to do with her, but also that somebody wants this to have happened, of her not to be in her flat. And she guesses that it is actually her old accomplice, Harry Fox, and that he has some particular reason for getting in touch with her. And so that's the beginning of the story. And she and Harry are drawn into an investigation of a murder at Trent Park. They're put onto it by somebody called Maxwell Knight, who I know you've heard of, Ollie, because everybody has. Maxwell Knight, a fantastically interesting character. Who in his later life became very famous as a BBC naturalist. He would talk about and what too. He was a much more maverick figure, actually. He ran his own little stable of agents, and he had his own little section of MI5, and he penetrated the fascist circles in the 1930s and managed to out them in Britain. But come the war, he's doing a slightly different job, and he gets in touch with Harry Fox and says, I've got a job for you.
So I'm quite interested in this role of a MI5 watcher, which is what Harry kind of is. And was it Maxwell Knight's idea, or I guess it's always been the case with espionage, you would have people, and I guess for the sake of listeners, watchers, I think, are an official role even today, where they're conducting surveillance of targets. But was this sort of something that Maxwell Knight refined? Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. And he was very individualistic about this. So the watchers, and I do quite a lot about this in Midnight in Vienna. So the watchers were a kind of stable of joint special branch and MI5 surveillance operatives, some of them quite rough, some of them off the books, but they were used to watch figures of interest, including the Duke and Duchess of Windsor when he was still Edward VIII and she was Wallis Simpson. Stanley Baldwin put the watchers onto them, and they were used to watch all sorts of later Oswald Mosley and Diana Mosley. And in Midnight in Vienna, they are put to watch all sorts of major literary figures who may have been suspected of communist sympathies. So they're basically, gumshoes, really, who followed around figures of the day. And Maxwell Knight himself, extremely right-wing, was very worried about the fascist threat in Britain. But of course, when the war came, the people who were watched were, slightly different. But he ran a stable of agents, and he liked to keep people in compartments. So he was a very interesting guy. He had a flat in Dolphin Square in Pimlico, and he had his own private zoo. He had bush babies, and he had a bear, a sloth, and all sorts of birds. And he was fascinated by animals, and people said he would always have an animal in his pocket. have a little thing, a lizard or like a kind of like shrew as he went around, and he sometimes would carry around like a snake in his bag. He was a really, really interesting guy, but also with people, he liked to keep his people apart. And his I mean, he married several times, but his also sexuality was quite sort of questionable. Nobody was sure where his loyalties lay on that one as well. But he was very, very interesting. And so in my fiction, he's taken on Harry. And Harry is exactly that kind of person who flies under the radar. He's a brilliant surveillance operative. Something terrible has happened in his past, and he's been suspended from MI5. But Maxwell Knight values that kind of off-grid characteristic he has and uses him when this terrible murder takes place. And the thing about Trent Park was it's so secret, such a secret establishment. It was called Cockfosters. It was known as Camp 11. They didn't, if you just brought in the police, a murder happens and you bring in the police, the danger is that everything, leaks. And it was such a valuable intelligence asset, really, that you were kind of absolutely bound not to let anything leak. So by bringing in Harry and Stella, that's how they begin to probe the murder and what the murder is. The person that's murdered is wearing the uniform of a German Luftwaffe officer. But all is not as it seems. Which you might think. Now, the weird thing about this is I call the book Appointment in Paris. And it has a great big chunk set in Paris. And I was very interested in what Paris was like between the 7th and the 10th of May, 1940. So 10th of May, 1940, the German Wehrmacht under Hitler launches its invasion of the Low Countries and progresses eventually in June towards France. And the 6-week blitzkrieg occupies most of Western Europe. And I was really interested in what the atmosphere was just before the Nazi invasion, whether people really, how seriously they believed that something was going to happen, or whether they were just like, oh, we've seen this all before. And
that's such an interesting question that you raised there, because in our kind of, and I guess we're changing this view now with the threats out in the world, but we've lived such a sheltered life. Can you imagine just the mere idea of your country being invaded?
I'm obsessed with this idea. I mean, for the past, it's hard not to be, with everything that we hear around us for the past few years. And it's partly why I chose 1938 for my first book, because I just wanted to know how it felt to really believe that existential threat was on its way. And by 1940, they can really see it in front of their eyes. I mean, you've seen the Germans go around the edge of the Maginot Line. You've seen them eventually take Paris. Most people must have believed that they were coming for Britain too, and at that level, this is so within living memory. And so now, because now we see, you look in the paper and you see the head of the army saying, war with Russia within 5 years and things, and you think, although we have people telling us that existential threat is out there, there's a sort of like gap between what we hear and what we believe or what we feel. And I think that's a very interesting gap. So I wanted to look at what it was actually like when you could really see, on the newsreels, you could see your neighboring country being invaded. And I'm sure, I know that there's lots of preparations in Britain for what would happen in the event of invasion. And there was a kind of army force. I don't mean Dad's army. I mean, there was a kind of special anti-invasion force.
And I think there'd been an education program going to sort of get the population into the mindset going into 39, hadn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course,
which we don't have anything like now. I mean,
well, because also they'd had 1938 and the Munich crisis. So people had already got the idea of, you were going to have an air raid shelter and things. And near where I live, on Wimbledon Common, there was a place where a huge amount of weapons were stored. I mean, it's very interesting that all around us, there are still these evidences of people's preparations for World War II invasion, which in the event never happened, as we know. It's something that really interests me, the psychology and mentality of how you cope with that idea at the back of your mind, or even the front of your mind. If you remember, Virginia Woolf writes about this in her diary, and says she's living in a village called Rodmell down in Sussex, and there was a meeting in the village hall where everybody discussed what they were going to do in the event of invasion. And she and Leonard, her husband, decided that they were going to gas themselves in the garage, but other people had other ideas. And so the idea of going to the village hall and sitting and talking about how you're going to kill yourself, which people did, even more people who were on the Nazis list, the list that had been drawn up of notable people who were to be liquidated as soon as invasion came. Because they're very useful for anyone studying the potential of Nazi invasion. The Nazis drew up a whole book about it, where they were going to go, who they were going to kill, where they were going to headquarter. Blackpool was very popular. Exactly what it's a comical book. You can easily get it. Because it gets so much about British society wrong. The Boy Scouts, for example, have sort of seminal importance in Nazi eyes, but it's a fascinating book, because you can see how they were thinking and what they were planning, which makes that whole moment in 1940 very interesting. But of course, going back to Paris, it actually happened in France, So we've got it's a very good novel called Suite Française by Irene Nemirovsky, I think that's right, who writes about what it's like as a Jewish woman to flee down to the south of France. And, they really experienced it. But we in Britain were kind of psyched for it, I think. So that's the Paris section of my book. But most of the book takes place in Trent Park, and there's obviously important plot reason why Stella has to go to Paris and track somebody down.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. The whole French experience, I'm fascinated reading about. I mean, they've really not dealt with the past. I think when Chirac apologised for behaviour during the Second World War, Mitterrand was furious with him.
Yeah, well, it's been a long and sorry tale, hasn't it? And I mean, I think it's been you can also contrast it with the way that the modern Germans have gradually processed the experience of World War II. It's all about shifting psychologies. So to begin with, the Germans, we all learned that the Germans immediately after World War II, all school children had to go and see pictures of concentration camps and things. And so I always assumed there was a kind of huge and widespread perception that great wrong had been done. But then I remember watching in 1963, there was something called the Frankfurt, there was something called the Auschwitz trials, where a guard from Auschwitz was being put on trial. And there was a vox pop, and I was watching this contemporary vox pop recently, and people were saying, what do you think about Auschwitz? You're an ordinary German in the street, what do you think? And they were saying, what is it? I've never heard of it. So our ideas about how different nationalities process war it's complex. And I think it applies just as much to Britain, in that I think that what we've had, which is quite, in many ways, in almost every way, quite rightly, enormous pride in the what was achieved, and in the courage of the Allies. But that also that did breed this kind of myth of British exceptionalism, that the British were different. They were different. And I've always been tantalized by how the British would actually behave if they were invaded. And I mean, I think that's such an important what if question, actually. And that's why, sorry, I'm really rambling.
No, I'm really enjoying this, because, of course, in your other world that you've created, Widowland in Queen Hall.
Widowland. Well, that was exactly it. That's why I wrote Widowland, actually. So I wrote this, as you say, alternative history, which was really about in that, Britain has come to an agreement with Germany and doesn't go to war. And so it's examining how people would behave if Britain had been a protectorate. And I did write it at I was finishing it during COVID. So, draw your own conclusions.
It's funny. I've been, and I don't like to mention other podcasts on this one, but there's one around called The War Game, which Sky and Tortoise Media have put together. And it's where you have a number of politicians, both Labour and Conservative, who, have you heard of this?
I've listened to it. It's
yes,
I strongly
me too.
Recommend it.
It's extraordinary and slightly depressing. It's very depressing listening for listeners. I'll put a link in. But it really, World War II comes up. They talk about, how the population dealt with a wartime period. And for listeners, this war game scenario is if the Russians decide to start attacking Britain. But I was fascinated by how the Second World War helped to direct some of the players in the game and how they would deal with it. And it speaks to what you were just saying about how important the Second World War is to Britain, but in a way that that exceptionalism in the war game, it's not it's not much of a spoiler to say it doesn't go well for Britain. But it's fascinating how the Second World War will be used even in modern day scenarios. I don't know what you think about that.
No, absolutely. And what I'm very interested in is the way that psychology. So in the war game, you've got. I was very interested as the thing goes on, and I'm not going to give any spoilers about it, but as the thing goes on and things look grave for Britain in the face of Russian aggression, there's the general injunction to the population is to stay at home. It's so like COVID, and dramatically different from World War II, obviously, where there was a huge ethos of everybody getting involved. And the reason that interests me is that I think that in times of war, it's very important that governments look to the psychology, the mass psychology of their population. And in World War II, there's huge attempts made to kind of unify the population, and also, we're all in it together, we'll meet again, etc., etc. Everybody's got a job. And I rather think in a future conflict, it will be much more do what we tell you, stay at home, and there will be great difference in psychology, which is probably why you now get your general population saying we're not going to fight in a war. We know it's more than 50% now say we wouldn't fight for Britain in a war, and which is devastating.
Yes, there's no feeling of community at all, and they the advice given is go and hide in your basement, which is a very sort of if you've got a basement, that's great.
Exactly. How many people haven't got a basement? And so what I think, I mean, even if you look back at Nazi Germany, which obviously I do a lot for I have written lots of novels about it, and particularly about Joseph Goebbels. One of the key things that Goebbels was obsessed about was you've got to manipulate the psychology of the populace if you're going to succeed at war. And he did it through culture, which is, what do you put in magazines? What films do you make? What novels do you allow people to read? So people are, obviously then it was easier, but people are able to be swayed by what they see. And Goebbels was interesting because at every stage of the war, he would slightly adjust the cultural output of the Reich Chamber of Culture to answer needs. So at a time when they were losing lots of troops on the Eastern Front, there would be films about very brave housewives who were kind of battling through. And at times when people needed uplift, there would be rom-coms. So he really, really paid attention to this. And in fact, there's a very interesting Lawrence Rees book recently called The Nazi Mind, about how the Nazis really gauged and manipulated the psychology of the population. And I think, so the dramatic difference now, particularly if what all the heads of the army, etc., say is correct, that we are facing some serious aggression from Russia, is how do you now manipulate the population? You've got a population that doesn't want to ever fight for their country. How do you go about manipulating them? And
that has been through the COVID experience as well, which makes it, I expect, not overly pliable for a government.
Well, they learned yeah, exactly. So they learned the dark arts of COVID, which did terrify people, but it fragmented people. And I think the key thing about a war is probably you've got to try and unify people. This is a million miles in a way away from detective fiction, but these are the kind of ideas that interest me. And I don't want anyone to think that either Midnight in Vienna or Appointment in Paris are kind of heavy duty psychological textbooks. They're really not. They're thrillers, and the answer to who gets killed and why they're killed at Trent Park is one that is eventually tracked down just in time.
Tantalizing stuff. But do you plan, so when you wrote the first word on the first page of Midnight in Vienna, did you know you would have Appointment in Paris coming along?
Yes, and I also know there's one called Last Night in Lisbon coming along as well. It's kind of, it was partly inspired actually, and this is a kind of tragic thing, but I was in Waterstones in Gatwick, and I was looking at this wall which said Destination Reads, and it was like lots and lots of novels with names of cities in the title. And I'd always been interested in Vienna and thought Vienna was very kind of obviously fascinating. And I thought, oh, why don't I do a series that got cities in the titles? And so I have. So there you go. But
that's very commercially minded. I like that. That's good.
It's great.
You'll appear on the shelf in Gatwick.
That's so well. Fingers crossed. Appointment in Paris turns up there. I kind of think, well, in America, I remember this is ages ago, it may not still apply, but I had an editor in America who said, I was writing a novel called The Words I Never Wrote. And I remember saying to I was kind of pitching it to her and telling her the plot. And I said, we're in 1945, the Red Army were at the doors of Berlin, gates of Berlin. And she said, can I just stop you there? Could this be Paris? I said, well, the Red Army didn't really go to Paris. And she said, could it be? And I said, no, but I can put Paris in it if you like. She said, please put Paris in it, because if you have Paris in the title, Americans, there's like something like a 13% bigger chance of Americans.
No, really?
I'm sure that doesn't apply anymore, but I was so stunned by that. And so actually it was, I had a storyline in Paris, but it's, America loves Paris. Yeah.
Well, who doesn't? I hope that this involved research in Paris, going and making sure the bistros are still up and running.
Super enjoyable research, and actually including the catacombs. So the resistance in Paris um, used the catacombs that go under the streets, and were used to bury the dead for years, centuries. But they were then used by the resistance, and so there were people in France thinking, "What the hell are we going to do?" And but I think what surprised them is the speed of the Nazi advance. Everybody was astonished at the speed of it, which I don't remember if you have done this on the podcast, but it's an amazing book by a German historian called Blitzed. Do you remember this?
No.
And it was, fascinating. And because everybody's always said, well, how did the Wehrmacht manage to kind of basically conquer most of Europe in such a rapid time? And he said it was a very popular drug in Germany in the 1930s called pervitin, which was like the housewife's friend, because it like pepped you up. It's basically speed. And it's lots and lots of ads for kind of, every housewife loves pervitin. And once the war starts, after 1939, German housewives are really, really anxious. And so they're buying up pervitin, and suddenly all the supplies dry up. The reason is the Wehrmacht's bought it all up, and it's giving it to soldiers so they can stay awake. So the reason they managed to kind of do so well is that they're on this kind of amphetamine. But the downside of pervitin was that it initially makes you euphorically awake, and then you have a terrible crash and you're kind of like psychotically depressed. So this was a fascinating sort of pharmacological commentary on the course of World War II, which is fascinating.
I now you mention it, I do remember it. I'll put a link in for the listeners if they're interested in that. Drugs in Nazi Germany. I read a very good novel actually, which was based on the experience of the author, and Sword of Bone. I don't know if you've read that.
No.
Which is about a written by Anthony Rhodes, who was in France from September 39, and then all the way to May 1940. And the first sort of 3-4 months, he's assigned to a kind of a French regiment as a liaison officer, and makes friends with a French officer, and the two have a whale of a time driving from, I think, around Brittany all the way through France into Paris. They go and check the Maginot Line out. All the while, they're whining and dining the whole way, and it's all very amusing. And then and the Maginot Line looks impregnable. Everything's fine, and then of course everything isn't fine. A few
I must read
days
that.
later, it's really, really good, really good. It was part of an Imperial War Museum set of novels which they republished about 5 years ago.
Oh, great.
So one of them's written by Anthony Quayle, the actor, who was a Royal Navy secret agent, I think, in Norway.
I think he was, yeah.
Yeah, but no, it's just
Reminded
really.
me of Noel Coward, who also appears in the book, because in May 1940, Noel Coward was drafted out to run the British propaganda unit in Paris. And he had to devise different ways of deterring the Germans. And he was fantastically sarcastic about it all. He had to the people back home had drawn up a sort of letter that had to be dropped en masse to German territory or places where Germans would pick it up and read it, about how the British only really wanted peace, and it was a great long thing. And he said, if the intention is to bore the Germans to death, then I think we'll succeed. But he was very funny, and he didn't do it for long, because it was a kind of lost art. But he used to have dinners for like bookish people in 1940 in Paris, and he had Nabokov and Samuel Beckett and all sorts of rather interesting people in the shadow of this great invasion that was coming. Anyhow, you've reminded me of him. I ought to definitely, having talked about Trent Park, I must say that a very important book to read is by the wonderful Helen Fry.
Yes.
Called The Walls Have Ears, the greatest intelligence operation in World War II, which is about Kendrick and Trent Park, and you know, she's a phenomenal historian and researcher, and really I haven't acknowledged her in the book, but I've got to pay tribute to her because she has truffled out all these facts, and it's a great story. So do read that.
And presumably you can visit Trent Park and have a look around even today?
Yeah, so this is actually another very, very interesting bit of the story. So for many decades, Trent Park lingered rather unloved, owned by Middlesex Council, or it was Adult Education Authority and things, and it was a bit grim, a bit dingy. Then Berkeley Homes decided to buy it. So it's bought by Berkeley Homes and to be turned into luxury flats, which is happening as we speak. But the basement where all these German Jewish refugees would sit clamped to headphones, typing out transcripts, was initially, as I understand it, to be ripped out and transformed into a swimming pool. I think I've got that right. But when people started saying, look, this is really historic, this is so important, it is now going to be preserved as a museum, which will be opened next spring. So I think from next spring, you will be able to go in, see the basement of Trent Park and read about the history, just as you can go into Bletchley Park. So I think that's wonderful. And it's fantastic that it was saved in this way.
Yeah, I definitely need to go and visit when that's ready. I just love the psychology of it, which I was thinking when you were talking about Kendrick and then Knight, of course, these are these sort of, they think, I guess the term is outside the box.
Really? I mean, well, Maxwell Knight was so far out the box that, there was no box that can contain him, I think. But Kendrick himself too, really an extraordinary man who saved lots and lots of lives in after the Anschluss, when desperate to escape Vienna. He put them into British citizens and help people escape that way. And after he was then rumbled and captured by the Gestapo and interrogated and finally got back to England, he was put in charge of this very important listening operation. So he's tremendous, but I feel never really, apart from the fab Helen Fry, never really got the recognition. But then this applies to so many secret operations. People that are so brave and so clever don't get the recognition that they deserve. He definitely deserved it. And so Trent Park, and there was also Latimer House was the kind of third establishment, but really, really interesting. And so that's been so interesting. And in last night in Lisbon, I look at the double cross operation, which how can you not love that? But that's yet to come.
I'm very much looking forward to that. Jane, look, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much for coming on to talk about it. And of course, there are links in the show notes for listeners. Just leaves me to thank you.
Thank you. And, Appointment in Paris out in September. And thank you so much, Ollie. It's been brilliant. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Never.
I know. All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.